Welcome. I'm delighted that so many of you are here. It's great to see a attendance at a philosophy lecture so early in the year, so well attended. And it gives me great pleasure to actually welcome an individual who has been part and parcel of the BLSI for many years. He actually was one of our students in the sixth form philosophy seminars that we run here about 5 or 6 years ago. So it's great to see him back, a fully fledged philosopher after graduating from philosophy from Oxford in PPE, and he's now doing his MPhil at Cambridge on Wittgenstein and Kant. And I've got it on good authority that he'll probably be doing his PhD in Oxford back on Wittgenstein. But that is all in the future now. So it gives me great pleasure to have someone present the second half of Wittgenstein's philosophy, because, you know, not many philosophers have changed their mind and actually basically disowned all of their early philosophy. So Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus, which gave rise to logical positivism and a very different way of doing philosophy, very analytical, looking at words and their meanings in some detail. The philosophical investigations, which were published posthumously in the 1950s, is a big departure from his early work. And I'm really looking forward to Emmanuel explaining and elucidating Wittgenstein's philosophy in his later years. So please put your hands together for Emmanuel.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I should say I have not been accepted. I'm applying to PhDs at the moment. So doing a PhD is very much still a hoped-for thing. And I wouldn't want to get ahead of myself by thinking I was already there. So yeah, hi, I'm Emmanuel, or Manny. I am currently an MPhil student at Cambridge. I worked on Wittgenstein last term, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So I will begin this, as these things tend to, with an anecdote. So in 1929, John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, wrote to his wife, Lydia, to tell her, "God has arrived. I met him on the 5:15 train." And Keynes was talking, of course, about Wittgenstein, who was returning to Cambridge after a 10-year hiatus. So sorry if you've heard this anecdote before. It's one of a kind of collection of anecdotes that people tend to bring out about Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein have a life full of interesting stories that make good anecdotes like this. But really the point of this anecdote is to give you an indication of Wittgenstein's importance. It's essentially an appeal to authority. And the reason for doing this is that Wittgenstein is very difficult. If you've ever tried to read Wittgenstein, you'll know that he writes in kind of quite enigmatic sentences. Often it can be sometimes easy to think that you understand something. And then if you kind of come away and try to explain it to another person, you realize that maybe you didn't understand as much as you thought. And so I think, at least in my case, it was helpful to me to have this impression of Wittgenstein as this thinker that was worth engaging with deeply and seriously to push through some of the difficulties with that. And this thing about Wittgenstein and the difficulty with it also sets up the context for how I'm going to do this talk. So there's lots of different ways that people give these kind of talks about historical philosophers. One quite popular way, which I'm not going to do today, is to just take a nice kind of segmented argument, something very clear and clean, and say, look, this is what this philosopher tries to get to. This is how they get there. Isn't this interesting? But the difficulty of doing this with Wittgenstein is that almost everything he wrote is so controversial, even among the philosophical community, especially in the Wittgenstein's later works. It's so controversial that it's difficult to give anything that's clean and clear and uncontroversial from that. And the other problem is that I think that sometimes when people say that, the person watching the talk might think, oh, that's an interesting argument, whatever. They might go away and look more into Wittgenstein, maybe open the book and read it, and find it very hard to recover the talk they were given in the text itself. And so one of the things I want to do today is give you a little bit more of the flavor of the text and what it's actually like working with Wittgenstein. And I hope that in doing that, I can encourage you to read it. And if you do, or if you are interested in it, you won't be put off by the differences in the style of the talk and the style of the thing. So, okay, the aims for this talk, I've got three. So the first is to introduce some of the themes of Wittgenstein's rule-following marks that are relevant to Wittgenstein's whole work, and to try to explain why that's interesting. The second is the thing I was just talking about, to give you an impression of what it's like to work with Wittgenstein and do philosophy, to start with a kind of historical text and work up into an argument. And right at the end, I'm going to discuss two ways that people read the rule-following remarks as a whole, to give you an idea of how people actually understand this thing. And the plan for how the talk's going to achieve those aims is, firstly, to give the context for the rule-following chapters in Wittgenstein's life and work. Then to actually look at the rule-following comments themselves, and discuss some of the kind of interesting and puzzling things Wittgenstein says about the rule-following comments. And finally, to discuss two ways that they can be kind of read as a whole. So in the second section, I think I'm just going to be sort of bringing up some difficulties, some tensions, but not maybe resolving them. And then at the end, I'll try and come back and say something that ties some of that other stuff together. So if in the middle section I'm saying things and it is a little bit hard to understand and it's not obvious how it all comes together, I'll try and cover that bit at the end. Okay. So let's do a little bit on Wittgenstein's life, because he did have a very, very interesting life. So in 1889, Wittgenstein was born in Vienna. He was born to a fabulously wealthy family, a very, very cultured family. Brahms and Mahler came to their family home and did concerts. His sister had a portrait done of her by Klimt. They knew Rodin, I think. And when he was a kind of young man, he moved to Manchester to study aeronautical engineering. He was working on a propeller. And through this aeronautical engineering, he became interested in mathematics. And through being interested in mathematics and the foundation of mathematics, he became interested in philosophy. And in 1911, he travels to Cambridge to meet Bertrand Russell, who was at the time the kind of big philosopher, the person everyone was talking about. And he studied with Bertrand Russell about maths and logic and other things. And he would go away to Norway for periods of time to think about these kind of big philosophical problems. In 1914, he signed up to the Austrian army in the breakout of the First World War. He was fighting against our side, and he was a very brave soldier, apparently. He did all kinds of dangerous military actions. And at the end of the war, he spent 9 months in an Allied prisoner of war camp. During the war, Wittgenstein kept notebooks, and these notebooks recorded his thoughts on kind of logic and mathematics, and they became the draft of his first major work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And this was published in 1921 in German, and then in English in 1922. And having finished the Tractatus, Wittgenstein, quite famously, thought that he had basically solved philosophy. He thought that he had put to rest all the serious philosophical issues of the day, and he went away and had a decade of just doing other things. So he inherited a massive fortune, which he split up and gave away to his various family members, so he didn't have that anymore. He went to a rural primary school and taught. And then in 1926, there was a scandal where he hit a child and had resigned his position and fled away. He went back to Vienna, and in 1926, he began to build a house for his sister. And it's during this period in Vienna in the late 1920s that he begins to become interested in philosophy again through talking to the Vienna Circle. And in particular, he began to think that some of the things he had thought in his earlier philosophy were wrong. So in 1929, he returns to Cambridge. And this is where the Maynard Keynes quote that I began with comes in. And through the end of the 20s and the 30s, he begins to develop his later philosophy. So the Blue and Brown books are two works that show this process of development. He didn't actually publish them. They were a series of lecture notes that he made that were disseminated around his students. But it's a kind of key point that shows his philosophical development. And then he kind of works and works and works. He never publishes anything in his lifetime again. In 1951, he dies, and he leaves behind the manuscript for the philosophical investigations. And this was translated and published in 1953. And the two key things here really are the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which is his early philosophy, and then the Philosophical Investigations, were his later philosophy. So there's lots of other books that get published by Wittgenstein, but most of these other books are really just published remarks, like diaries and things like journals that he wrote down his thoughts in that then get published. These are the only two things that have serious canonical status as Wittgenstein texts. The Philosophical Investigations, even though it wasn't published in his lifetime, he very nearly published it twice and kind of pulled it for publication. And it's much, much more set out as like a proper book than a lot of the other remarks that maybe get talked about. Okay, so what are these two philosophies? I won't go into this too much because we've got to get to the fun bit, main bit about the rule-following comments. But in the early philosophy, Wittgenstein talks a lot about representation and the world. He has an idea which is basically logically atomist. So it's kind of this idea that you start out with these very basic logical building blocks, and then through logical relationships build things up. And in the later philosophy, Wittgenstein very clearly rejects a lot of this earlier image. It's not clear exactly how much he rejects, and there's a lot of scholarly debate about how different these two philosophies are, but it's at least clear that, say, this logically atomist idea does get removed in the later work. So the Philosophical Investigations, if you buy it today, it looks like a list of remarks. It's 693 comments. Some of these are like a sentence or maybe a paragraph. Some of them are about a page. And it's quite strange when you first come to Wittgenstein to think about what are these and how do these work. But really, the reason for them is just how Wittgenstein produced his books in the first place. So he was a philosopher that worked by insight. He wasn't a very methodical person. So these kind of ideas would occur to him. He would write them down in these books. And then after a while, he would go back over these books, copy out the ones that he thought were particularly good, go and take them to a typist, get them typed up, and then he would literally cut them out and paste them in different orders together to try and make strings of argument. He thought that it was important that these, when they formed the Philosophical Investigations, these would follow on from each other. There are no divisions within the Philosophical Investigations where there's, one particular topic dealt with and then another particular topic dealt with, and so on and so forth. So the rule-following remarks are not clearly delineated. It's a section taken out of this book between the remark 138 and remark 242. It's roughly a sixth of the Philosophical Investigations, which talk about topics that are roughly the same. But these topics come up all throughout the Philosophical Investigations, and there's a debate about maybe how arbitrary it is to call these things one thing, the rule following remarks, but that's the way that people talk about it in the literature. So again, given the context of this talk, I'm not going to say too much what exactly Wittgenstein, what goes on before, how the rule following remarks come about, because it would take an age. But it's the things that are important for understanding the context of these rule following remarks within the Philosophical Investigations is that Wittgenstein is clearly trying to go against a certain view of language. And that view of language is what is called sometimes the Augustinian picture of the world. And the Augustinian picture of the world is a picture where words and things, or language and things, bear this kind of one-to-one isomorphic relationship with each other. So say the bottle of water, there's a bit of a piece of language there, the bottle of water, there's an object, and the Augustinian view of language would be that this is how language works. There's this phrase, there's this thing in the world, there's one's a picture of the other or something like that, and then you build up from there. And Wittgenstein in the Philosophical Investigations clearly wants to reject this image, and he wants to talk about language as something much more varied and diverse. He talks about the different ways that languages can be used, and in particular, he comes up with this idea of language games. And so a language game is what kinds of things, it's the idea of what kinds of things are appropriate, moves. If someone says one thing, you can think of that as analogous to a move in a game, and then there's a response to it, which is another move in the game. So when you think about language like this as these kind of games, there's much less temptation to think about the parts of language as, corresponding to things out there in the world. And naturally, when we think about games, we think about rules. And I think this is one of the reasons why the rule following comments are so interesting. And so after the rule following section, just to again give you the context, this is kind of what happened before. After the rule following section, Wittgenstein goes straight into what's called the private language argument. And this is the other big thing from the philosophical investigations. So if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it too much. But if you do, that might help you situate the things that I'm going to say within Wittgenstein's work. Okay, so that's a very, very quick and dirty run through Wittgenstein's kind of project. So now let's go on to the rule following comments themselves. I'm going to draw out 4 themes from the rule following remarks. And in each case, I'm going to talk about what's something interesting about them. I'm not going to really resolve these. I'm just kind of curious. And then at the end, I'm going to come back and kind of give you an idea of how they might fit together. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is Wittgenstein talks about understanding a cube, what it is to understand a cube. The second thing is that Wittgenstein talks about reading and how reading works, and the discussion here of family resemblances, which is an important Wittgensteinian concept. The third thing is about the public nature of rules. So Wittgenstein thinks rules are public, and I'm going to look at why. And the fourth thing is that Wittgenstein thinks that rules have a lot to do with something very, very strong to do with agreement. I'm going to talk about why that is. So we'll start off with a cube. This is where Wittgenstein starts off. So what is it to understand a cube? So maybe we could just take a second to think about what it might be to understand a cube. So this, I am now beginning to quote Wittgenstein, and this is the beginning of the rule following comments. So I'll read this one out in full, but there will be less quotation from hereafter. When someone says the word cube to me, for example, I know what it means. But can the whole use of the word come before my mind when I understand it in this way? And Wittgenstein says, yes, that it can, but then he kind of thinks there's a difficulty about this yes. What comes before our mind when we understand a word? Isn't it something like a picture? Can't it be a picture? So Wittgenstein's thinking here of a theory where if someone says what it is to understand the word cube is for when you say the word cube to them, they can come up with a picture in their mind of a cube. And this is a kind of picture theory of understanding. And here we get the main bit of the argument. Well, suppose a picture does come before your mind when you hear the word cube, say the drawing of the cube. In what way can this picture fit or fail to fit the word cube? Perhaps you say, it's quite simple. If that picture occurs to me and I point to a triangular prism, for instance, and say it's a cube, then this use of the word doesn't fit the picture. But doesn't it fit? I have purposely so chosen the example that it is quite easy to imagine a method of projection according to which the picture does fit after all. Okay, so that might be a little bit confusing. And it's in part confusing because Wittgenstein does this thing a lot where he writes things from the perspective of a supposed interlocutor, someone talking to him. So these quotes within the Wittgenstein quote are this interlocutor that Wittgenstein's imagining, which is supposed to basically be a stand-in for the reader. So here's an illustration of what I think is going on in that last chapter. So this is a Wittgenstein. He's thinking of a picture of this cube. And now he sees a triangular prism. And Wittgenstein points at the triangular prism and he says, that is a cube. So on the picture theory, on the theory of language that Wittgenstein is considering here, this is wrong. This is wrong and you can't do this. And the reason why it's wrong is that, well, we've got this picture in our head of the cube and we're looking at this triangular prism. And obviously the picture of the cube doesn't fit the triangular prism. So that's what explains why it's wrong. Now, Wittgenstein's point in this paragraph is that that this doesn't work because maybe there is a way in which the picture of the cube applies to the triangular prism or could be a representation of something that fits the triangular prism. So in particular, one way that it could work is that a cube is itself a prism. It's a kind of prism. It's a square prism. Now, when we have our picture of the cube, we understand that picture of the cube as a representation of a prism in general, then when we look at the triangular prism and say, oh, that's a cube, the picture is fitting, because you've got a picture that you're using to represent a prism, you've got an object in front of you which is a prism. So the picture does fit the prism. So I've got, just to clarify this, so we've got this blue circle on the left. And then we could say, well, does the blue circle fit the blue triangle? And well, there's a way in which it does, there's a way in which it doesn't. It kind of depends what you're looking for. And this is even true when we look at the blue circle and the red pentagon. I mean, probably if someone showed you these and just said, does this fit? You might say no. But in other contexts, if the blue circle is just supposed to be generically representing a shape, a 2D shape, say, then the red pentagon is also a 2D shape. And so the one does fit the other. And so to go back to, Wittgenstein's quote, there could be a method of projection from a picture of the cube to the triangular prism. And so it doesn't show that it would be a misunderstanding for you to say that in that way, if that's how you understood it. So now Wittgenstein imagines an objection. So what if someone says, well, okay, that's not a picture of a cube, could fit that. But what if we have a picture of our cube and we also try and imagine a method of projection? And the way that Wittgenstein writes this is saying, well, let's say we've got one cube and we've got another cube, and then we connect them with lines to try and show the one being projected onto the other. Then that will surely show how the cube is being applied, and then this won't apply to the triangular prism. But Wittgenstein responds to this and says, well, does this really get you any further? Can't we just raise the same problem again? We've got this picture, but we can just imagine that picture again being used differently. So this is kind of what the person's thinking of. They're thinking of two pictures of cubes that are linked together with lines, and they're hoping that this will stop the image of the cube, the picture of the cube, applying to the triangular prism, because it won't be able to fit that. But again, this just depends how you use this schema. There's a way of looking at that picture where it represents projections between two cubes, but there's another way of looking at where it just represents a kind of bad drawing of a 3D shape, right? You can just imagine all the lines making faces, and then that being another kind of, I think that would be a hexagonal prism. So Wittgenstein thinks that idea doesn't work. So what does this show? Wittgenstein says it calls our attention, reminds us of the fact that there are other processes beside the one that we originally thought of, which we should sometimes be prepared to call applying the picture of a cube. So the idea here is that when you start off and I say, okay, apply a picture of a cube, you might have like a pretty good idea of what you think that would be like, and it would just be like going around and pointing at all the cube things. But what Wittgenstein's shown through this example is that there are sometimes things like calling a triangular prism a cube that we would call applying a picture, not calling it a cube, applying the picture of a cube to a triangular prism to show that it's a prism, that we might call applying the picture of a cube. So this thing that we maybe thought of was like a kind of hard, this is what this image means, this is what it works, is only a custom that we've developed. So yeah, people expect, the picture makes us expect a different use because people generally apply this picture like this, but there's nothing necessary about this use. So what does this have to do with rule following? Haven't I just been talking about cubes for the last 15 minutes or whatever? Well, this has got to do with rule following because Wittgenstein thinks that sometimes people think of rules like this. They think of a rule as something that just simply tells you what to do. You just have a picture of a rule and it's just obvious what we should do from it. We can just kind of read it off. And Wittgenstein is saying, maybe this is less obvious. maybe this thing that we have as a rule that we think we can just respond to normally, there would be situations where we would see it differently, and we're being kind of discomforted in that. So yeah, it forces us to confront the idea that in some situations we might be prepared to call odd things following a rule, and so the idea of rule following is less simple than we first imagined it. Okay, this is the second theme. So this is family resemblances. So again, if some of you are familiar with Wittgenstein, you might be aware or know about the term family resemblances, but if not, don't worry, I'll try and explain it. So Wittgenstein has a discussion of reading, where he's talking about reading. And when Wittgenstein talks about reading in this context, he doesn't mean reading in the sense of understanding that we normally would. Like, it's not just like sitting down and reading a book. He means something more like reading out loud. So yeah, copying something printed, playing from sheet music, and so on. So Wittgenstein makes a few points about this kind of concept of reading that we might have. So he says, okay, imagine we've got an Englishman reading, and we say he's reading he's reading the morning newspaper. What might he be doing? And Wittgenstein thinks there's more things than we might initially think of. So if he speaks a sentence as he's reading it aloud, that seems like a form of reading. And it seems not to matter if he's really, we're not concerned if he's got anything in his head when he's doing that. If he just looks at the sentence and reads it, even if you asked him 5 seconds later what he read and he couldn't remember, he would have still read it in that sense. If he says a sentence to himself in his mind, so if he kind of looks at the words and thinks what they mean, that seems like a form of reading, even if he doesn't read it aloud at all. Wittgenstein says that even if he speaks it neither aloud nor in mind, but afterwards is able to repeat it or almost repeat it, then would also say that he'd read the sentence in this sense. And so this goes to show that this is supposed to show, from Wittgenstein's perspective, that there's lots and lots of different things that we might be we might call reading, or we might be willing to consider reading more than we might first think. So his second point, and kind of related to the first one, is that context will depend for what we are prepared to call reading. So it's kind of an odd example. I don't know how intuitively persuasive it is, but Wittgenstein thinks that we will have very different standards for the beginner and the expert, specifically because in the expert case, we won't be particularly worried about what he's thinking in his mind, the experiences he's having while he's reading, as long as he does a decent job of just going through the text. So if he is able to just say the sentences, even if he doesn't have any particular experiences while he's doing it, he's clearly reading it. Whereas Wittgenstein thinks that for a beginner, if we've got a beginner who's just reading something, then that we would want to pay attention to those experiences of looking at the text making a kind of sound occur to you or something like that, and then saying that sound. So Wittgenstein thinks that there's different standards here. And a third point that Wittgenstein makes about reading is that we can generate a continuous series of transitional cases between things that are clearly reading and things that are not reading, like memorizing. And this makes it very difficult to say where exactly a person starts reading. So here I've got a little line. So it goes on the left side, you've got things that are definitely not reading, and on the right, you've got things that definitely are reading. So if you completely memorized a text and then say you literally have no ability to decipher symbols, you could have memorized the text, you could look at the symbols and say the thing that you've memorized. It's obviously not reading. And then we can kind of go a case down from that. So say, oh, you've basically memorized it, but you need prompts sometimes, and you can't completely decipher the symbols, so you can't read in the normal sense, but you can use them as markers to prompt you in this thing that you're reciting. And then in the third case, so this is quite a lot closer to reading, we might have someone who guesses the occasional word from context. So say, a child or something like that. Maybe there are some words they don't know, so they find them hard to read, but they've heard enough English, or they speak English well enough that they can guess in a lot of cases what word that would have been. Probably call that reading. And then if someone spells out every single word as they go through it, that definitely seems like reading. And so these considerations about the term reading lead Wittgenstein to question whether there is anything essential that has to happen in all cases of reading. And he thinks it looks slippery. He thinks it's uncertain. He thinks it's not the case. And he thinks the problem is that we're always trying to look for something, and he thinks this is the problem with philosophy in general, is that we're trying to get to something essential in a word like reading, something that happens in every single case. And actually, he thinks there isn't anything like this. There's no one thing that happens in all the cases of reading. And he has a very beautiful, I think, metaphor for this, which is, in order to find the real artichoke, we divested it of its leaves. Just imagine someone who doesn't know what an artichoke is, peeling the leaves away, looking for the real artichoke at the middle of it. And this concept is an example of what Wittgenstein calls a family resemblance concept. So there's a few things that make family resemblance concepts what they are. One is that they have kind of unclear boundaries. But in two senses, actually. In one sense, where it's not clear, there are lots of cases where we would say, oh, I don't know if that's reading or not. But also in the case, they're unclear in the sense that maybe they evolve or shift over time. The boundaries aren't kind of fixed. The second idea of family resemblances, and this is from the name of the term. If you imagine kind of family photo of a very big family, there might be lots of similarities that you notice between the people. You know, two people have the same nose, two people have similar eyes, maybe people have similar hair, but there might be no one thing that everyone has. So there's lots of similarities between different groups of collections of people, but there's no overall similarity that they all have. And yeah, this is nothing essential to all items. So Wittgenstein thinks this is true in the case of reading as well. Reading is an example here, but it's not specific. The point is supposed to generalize. And the point, presumably, is to do with rules, which is that reading's a kind of rule-following activity, but given there's no essential thing that is done when we read, there's just a kind of collection of cases of things that we would consider reading. This is true for all cases of following a rule. Whenever we're talking about someone following a rule, they can, or maybe not all, but in lots of, there are definitely lots of cases where following a rule is not going to be just one thing. It's going to be lots and lots of different ways of doing the same thing that are going to count. Okay, so on to the third theme, the public nature of rules. So, okay, this discussion gets a little bit difficult. So I apologize if this starts going too fast, but it'll get easier after, but I do warn you. So the public nature of rules. So Wittgenstein says, and this actually is an early version of the private language argument. Lots of people link this to the private language argument, which comes after the rule following comments. But he says, to think one is following a rule is not to follow a rule. And that's why it's not possible to follow a rule privately. Otherwise, thinking one was following a rule would be the same thing as following a rule. So yeah, Wittgenstein thinks that rule following is in some sense public. This is initially mysterious and cryptic. So why does he think this? It's not very obvious at all. So to explain it, we're going to have to go back to the cube example earlier, where the picture of the cube alone was not sufficient for understanding the cube because it depended on how one used that picture. But it was also true that having more pictures of, say, how to apply the picture doesn't help, because every time you add another picture of how to apply the last picture, you generate a question of, well, how do you apply that picture? And so you generate a regress. And what this shows is that understanding a cube is not like just having a picture of it in any form. Right. So Wittgenstein thinks that the same thing is true about rules and courses of action. So say someone has a course, so say there's some action that gets done, and there's a rule. it might look to us like, well, the action's going against the rule. But Wittgenstein says, well, but if you think really hard about it, you could surely come up with an interpretation whereby the action would be in line with the rule. But this only shows us that considering rules this way leads to paradox. And so having further interpretations doesn't help, because they themselves need other interpretations to interpret them, and then this leads to a regress. So it's worth saying, by the way, when Wittgenstein talks about rules like this, he tends to mean things like, he seems to a lot of the time mean to do with expressions of rules. So like a signpost is an example that he uses sometimes. So, take this person here. We would all look at this and say, well, the person's not following the rule of the signpost. They're not following the direction the signpost is looking at. But Wittgenstein is thinking, well, what if we're playing a game where the arrow indicates in the opposite direction to its point? So it points away from the sharp side of the arrow. Like if we're playing that game, then the person is following the signpost, and they are following the rule that it suggests. And so this is what I mean about interpretation. So what Wittgenstein says we can get from this is that there's a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation, but which from case to case of application is manifest in what we call following a rule or going against it. So he doesn't think that interpretation is the key. And what he says is the key instead of interpretation. He says following rules are not interpretation. He thinks it's a practice. Okay, so I told you this is cryptic. Why does this help? Why does saying or following a rule is a practice get you out of this problem that he's come up with in interpretations? Well, I'm going to not decide this here, but I'm going to suggest two ways of thinking about this, two ideas. So one way of understanding practice is things that are actually done, things that happen. So this is like practice as opposed to theory, like this you've got theory and you've got practice, the real world kind of impact. And Wittgenstein sometimes talks about rules or following a rule as a custom, a routine, an institution. And what's kind of salient about these kinds of things is that they're all part of some bigger thing that's observable and kind of out there in the world. Like if you've got a routine or a custom or an institution, you have to have done it before. It has to be like a thing that's been done many times, and that your action is fitting in within a context of this other stuff. And so maybe Wittgenstein's saying that following a rule is public because it's like this. Following a rule is only makes sense. There's a point where he says following a rule only makes sense. You couldn't have one person at one time following a rule. To understand what it is for someone to follow a rule, you have to understand the idea that it's something that has to be able to be and have been done lots of times before by different people and so on. The second idea of why rule following being public because it's a practice is thinking of practice as know-how. So this is opposed to knowing that. So some kind of like practical knowledge, like an ability to ride a bike or something like that. So to have mastered a technique. Yeah, so again, it's not that obvious why this has to be something in public. But the idea really here is that it's that practice is not a kind of interpretation. It's a kind of non-interpretive way of engaging with something. So Wittgenstein's worry about the rules before was that if when you look at a sign, you then have to interpret the sign, then well, why think of your interpretation of the sign like that? You could think about another way. So you need an interpretation of interpretation, and it kind of regresses. But if following rules is a practice, a kind of knowing how, then you don't need that because there's no interpretation. It's a kind of competency you have, and that doesn't require an interpretive way of thinking about engaging with things. Okay. So that's the third theme. So on to the final theme, which is now agreement. And this is another very kind of curious thing that Wittgenstein seems to talk about. So he says that following a rule is a custom, as I said before. But the thing about customs, or one of the things that we usually think about customs, is there's nothing essential to the customs that we have. You know, they could be changed. Customs could be otherwise than they are, and they would be otherwise than they are if people just did things differently. And Wittgenstein seems to think that the agreement is really important for rules. So disputes do not break out among mathematicians over whether or not a rule has been followed. And there's another book where he says it's essential, this is essential, that mathematicians don't argue about whether or not rules have been followed. But the question we might have is, does this not make rule following arbitrary if it's just been decided by custom? So if things, the way to follow rules is correct or incorrect is just based on what we agree, then it would that would go against a lot of our intuitions about things like maths, right? Because we maybe think normally that the reason why 2 + 2 is 4 isn't just because we say it's 4, we've agreed that it's 4. It's because it really, really is 4. And there's something kind of important about that. So Wittgenstein's position on this is kind of ambiguous and hard to make out. But what he says is this. So this is the interlocutor, right? So the interlocutor says to Wittgenstein, so you're saying that human agreement decides what's true and false. And this is clearly an accusation against Wittgenstein, though. I mean, it would be terrible if you thought that. And Wittgenstein responds, what is true or false is what human beings say, and it is in their language that human beings agree. This agreement is not in opinions, but rather in form of life. So again, it's very suggestive, but quite hard to pin down what exactly Wittgenstein's saying here. It's clear, at least, though, that he doesn't think that human agreement just decides what's true and false. So it's not true that, you know, for any given statement, the reason why it's true is just because human beings agree it. He thinks that his points about agreement and custom are to do with the language itself. So yeah. So the distinction here is between what human beings say and their language. And this is a kind of representation of this. So Schneer's Weiss is a German sentence. That's an individual instance of language you can get in German. And the language itself is the German language. So Wittgenstein thinks that it's in the latter where custom's needed. And that this belongs to the scaffolding from which our language operates. This agreement in the second bit. But to confuse it even more from the difficulty, he adds that sometimes you do need agreement in judgments, in individual instances of language. There are some opinions which do have to be agreed about. And again, this is quite confusing. Why does he think this? So what he says is that measuring is in part determined by a certain constancy in the results of measurement. And this links back to something that Wittgenstein talks about earlier, which is that there are some things in language games that have different status than other things. So the example that he gives is it's not true anymore, but for a while, the definition of a meter was based on this meter stick in Paris that was the international meter stick. And so when you wanted to know what a meter was, you say, well, how many of these is the thing? And Wittgenstein is interested in this because he says, well, how long is that meter stick? Like, there's a sense in which it's a meter, but the way in which it's a meter is very different from the way anything else is a meter. Like, imagine that a person came to you and said, you know, this table, like, so if I believed that this table is 2 meters long and they came and said, no, this table's not 2 meters long, but then we just disagree about how long the table is. And this is kind of fair enough. This is just a disagreement about how big an object is. But if they came to me and say, the international meter stick in Paris isn't 1 meter long, it's very confusing. What am I supposed to think about that? To me, I would have to say, well, you just don't understand what a meter is. But it's a completely different kind of argument from the argument that we would have about the length of a table. And I think this is what Wittgenstein is trying to get at in this idea that there are some agreements in judgments that's required for communication by means of language. So that's an example of one that might be, right? That the international meter stick in Paris is 1 meter. If someone doesn't believe that the international meter stick in Paris is 1 meter, then it's going to be very hard to communicate with them about distances or lengths, because you're just talking about different things. And arguably, there's not going to be communication going on there at all. Yeah. So, okay. So that's comprises the second section of my talk. And now I'll get into the third section. This will be quite brief. But I'll just try and give you 2 ways of reading those 4 kind of sections and threading them together. So the first one is realism about rules. I've put rules there. This is probably quite a controversial statement, but the realism about rules it's not a revision and review that says, you know, there are no rules. So rules are still there, but Wittgenstein showing us that rules are different to how we maybe thought they were, and in particular, they're different from this picture or kind of interpretation view of rules that he thinks has gone before. So he thinks what the image of the cube represents is the idea that we need to have non-interpretive understanding. We can't just have kind of interpretations and interpretations. We need to use cubes and things like that. The point of the family resemblance section, the discussion of reading, is to further attack this picture view of rules by showing you that there's no one thing that all these that happens in all these cases, and therefore, if a rule was a picture, there couldn't just be one picture that was applied to everything. The third, I've put 1 3 times. It should go up in numbers, but it doesn't. The public nature of rules. So this follows from the non-interpretive view of rule following. There's a philosopher called McDowell who has a line where he says, you can hear the meaning in someone's voice. You don't have to listen to what they say, interpret what they say, and then come out with a meaning. You can just kind of hear it in what they're saying. And so in the same way, the public discussion of rules is that you can just see what the rule is saying. You don't have to interpret it. It just suggests itself to you. But it doesn't just suggest itself to you, it suggests itself to everyone, because that's how that is what allows it to be a rule. And that's why rules have to be public, because they have to be these things that everyone can access in this non-interpretive way. And then finally, the importance of agreement is that rules are irreducible. So they can't be understood from outside. You can't break down and explain what rules are in terms of non-rule based concepts. So you have the agreement's very, very important. Agreement in how people see these rules is important, because unless someone's looking from within the rule-based perspective, they just can't understand what's going on. So that's the kind of realist view of what Wittgenstein's saying. Although I should say that, yeah, the point of this argument, if you take this to be what Wittgenstein's saying, is that he is attacking another also realist view of rules that he disagrees with. So he's saying it's not that kind of realism where it's like a picture. It's this kind of realism where you can just see what rules are telling you can do. You can, and that's a public thing that everyone understands, and they're irreducible. They can't be explained in terms of other things, and so on. Okay, so there's also anti-realism about rules. And on this view, rules are not real things in themselves. They are constructed in our patterns of agreement, disagreement, correction, and so forth. And so the cube, the point of the cube example is that how we take a cube is just custom. It's just something that we can decide. We've got this picture, we can apply it however we want. And if we applied it differently, it would mean something different. The point of the family resemblances discussion of reading is that there's no essence to the family resemblance concept. So a concept like reading, we could just apply to whatever we wanted, and whatever we applied it to and however we applied it to, that's what the concept would start meaning, because concepts just have this family resemblance structure. The public nature of rules. So given a rule is a custom, as I said in the first thing, it's just a kind of use. It has to be manifest in the world. So we just have a series of use cases. And we look at those, and that tells us what the rule is, and it's public. And finally, agreement's important because all a rule is just different people doing different things, disagreeing with each other, correcting, and so forth. And rules are just the pattern of that. They are nothing over and above the agreements that people kind of make about rules and the constructions that go on. Okay, so which one's right? I prefer anti-realism slightly. I think it's more in keeping with Wittgenstein's idea that there's nothing essential. I think the realist view about rules requires an idea of rules which is kind of based on the idea of like a skill or a competency or something like that we have. And it seems to me not that Wittgensteinian, but that's just my personal kind of view. That's not really the point of this talk. So yeah, that's the end. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed. Plenty of food for thought, I think. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions. There's some questions in the chat room already. I will start off in the room for people to ask questions. The only thing that you need to do is please speak directly into the microphone like this, otherwise. Who wants to go first? Ooh. People are still taking it in, I think. Oh, there's a gentleman at the back.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. Just to get things going, isn't the argument you described it realist versus anti-realist, but isn't it a different way of putting the anti-realist way, which is to say that rules are part of our way of living. It's part of life, and it's a sort of social practice sort of view of where language comes from and where meaning comes from.
Yeah. So, sorry, are you referring to the?
What I'm trying to get at is I'm not sure where the idea of realism versus anti-realism, that pair of concepts, is why it's being used as an analytical tool here. Whereas what it could be, for example, is the sort of like social practice or way of life argument being the anti-realist one, versus, for example, some sort of formulaic defined structure, so that within language we can create a defined structure where the rules are explicit and known, and if they're changed, we can say how they're changed. Whereas in the way of life sort of part of tool, what we're doing is saying that, well, you can't do that with language because it's constantly changing and evolving as part of our life.
Right. So, okay, good, yeah. I think this anti-realism and realism part is definitely it was. I went through it very quickly, so it's worth going over. So, so Wittgenstein is clear that agreement in our rules and our rule-based practices is part of our form of life. So both realists and anti-realists are going to agree with that. I think the real question, one way of putting the distinction between the realist and the anti-realist is to do with this concept of the reducibility of rules. So what the realist thinks is that in our human rule following action, we are in some sense guided by rules. So that if I do something, say, okay, yes, all right. So let's say I do something really basic. So let's say we have an example where someone is showing me objects, and I have to say whether the objects are red or not. On a realist view about rules, that's a rule following action, and I am following a rule when I do that, and I can't explain away the rule in terms of something else. There is a rule that's there, and it's justifying me, and it's not something I'm having to interpret, but it's something that I'm using to see whether the thing's red or not and to respond like that. On an anti-realist view, in a case like that, in a very, very basic case, probably what's happening is just that I'm being shown things and I'm responding to them in almost animalistically, almost like a Pavlovian kind of Pavlov's dog type response. Like I'm just saying the color, and the rule is not something that I'm using to do that or anything like that. It's just the fact that over, you know, the history and time in the period where I am and around the people I'm around, they would also tend to call that thing red. And that's just what the rule of if it's red, that see something red and say it's red. That's all it is. It's just that that's what I happen to do. It's not something that I'm kind of following. So that's maybe a way of putting the realist and anti-realist distinction, which is more helpful.
Okay, we've got a question online. It seems Wittgenstein was looking at idiomatic expressions and how individuals interpret them. This can be different for people from different cultures and native languages. Let me just scroll down, it's quite a long one. Rules would be different for these different cultures. Am I right in thinking this?
Yeah, so rules are clearly different in different cultures. So an example is adjective ordering. This is a kind of interesting one. So people, when they speak English, order adjectives in a very particular way that they all do. And native English speakers don't know that they're doing it. But for example, people will say the big brown German dog rather than the German brown big dog. Like when I said the second one, it sounds kind of weird, right? Like no one would ever say that. And that's a rule of how people order adjectives. Not all languages have the same rules. So there's other languages where people don't do that and they do it in different ways. Yeah, so the specific rules in those kind of ways will be different between different languages. So yeah, it's definitely true that not all languages have the same rules.
Okay, we've got another question in the room.
Thanks, Manny. That's super interesting. I'm just wondering, like when you had the list of the ideas up there, I think you can see them in photography and facial analysis. You can see those applied. You can see them in like discourse analysis and ideas of language change. I'm just wondering, did Wittgenstein, did his ideas, did they have any influence like outside philosophy? Did they go into any other areas that's outside philosophy where people kind of applied them?
It's a very interesting question. I am honestly not the right person to ask about this. So I actually started studying Wittgenstein relatively recently. So I don't know that well the legacy. I mean, okay, I'm sure they did in the abstract. And I also think that Wittgenstein's a very interesting philosopher because he's one of very, very few analytic philosophers that has had significant penetration into the kind of cultural mainstream in the way that lots of people have heard of Wittgenstein who, you know, would never have heard of, I don't know, David Lewis or some other person that within analytic philosophy is maybe considered very, very good. And there's been people have got very interested in Wittgenstein, within kind of continental philosophy, within people have written, you know, not fake, but like novels from the perspective of Wittgenstein's friends and things like that. So I think he kind of clearly has an ability to capture people's imagination. And I also think that his work is enigmatic enough that people can read lots of interesting things into it. But I couldn't talk about, you know, any more concrete kind of links between the different fields that he's influenced.
Okay, another question online is, to what extent are rules public because they are about interacting in and with the world?
It's a very good question. It's very hard to answer. Yeah. So I think there's a lot in that is I guess, okay, so the thing that I'm thinking about that maybe isn't like that is that for a very, very long time, people didn't really do like extremely complicated maths, right? There were literally like tens of thousands of years when human brains were capable of doing probably quite advanced math, and no one ever did it because it wasn't useful, they didn't have the time, they didn't have the resources, etc., etc. And I suppose what I'm wondering is whether or not those would be rules. If you're a realist, certainly you probably think that the mathematical rules are rules regardless of, you know, whether anyone's doing them. And for those kind of rules, there could have been really, really long stretches of time where they're not useful, no one's really interested in them, they aren't working within the engagement of human beings together in everyday life. But yeah, I'm sorry if that's not a great answer to the question.
No, that's fine. Now we've got Duncan online who's unmuted himself and showing his video. Duncan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so it's more a comment, but it also picks up on something that the speaker before asked, is whether Wittgenstein had any influence outside philosophy. And actually, in a way, he should have done, because but I think people came to the same conclusions, but an awful lot later. And I did philosophy 50 years ago, and we did a course on Russell, Frege and Wittgenstein. And we did the tractates first, and then we started on the philosophical investigations. And the thing that was very hard to get your head around was the idea of things being defined by examples. That we were used to the idea that you could define something. That's how people like Russell thought. That you had, if you like, somewhere in your head, a precise definition of something, even though it's quite difficult to explain what it was. And Wittgenstein was saying, no, that isn't the case. I just happen to have a copy of Philosophical Investigations here with me. And looking at 71, for example, where he's talking about a game. And what he says is that if you want to explain what a game is to someone, you give examples of games rather than saying, this is precisely what a game is. So he says it makes it all a bit vague, but what a game is, but you do it by examples. Coming forward about 20 years, I was working in IT, and there were people developing expert systems. The key thing about an expert system is you had an expert, like a doctor or an investor or whatever, who knew the rules. And what you're trying to do is to get your computer to understand those rules from the expert, and then they could emulate the expert. But basically inside the expert system was a set of clearly defined rules. And then coming along at the same time, it just starting, were neural networks. So coming forward, just a couple of years ago, Hannah Fry was giving a Royal Institution talk to children. And one of the things she was covering was about, she was saying, let's look at dogs, right? Give me a definition of a dog. And so kids were putting up their hands and saying, oh, a dog has 4 legs, or has ears, or a pointy nose, or my dog's got no nose, or how do you smell, etc. So she said, well, what we'll do is we'll take a piece of...
Duncan, I'm just for the sake of interest, do you have a question? Because obviously, you know, we want to sort of get other people to ask some questions as well.
Well, okay, I'm getting very much to the point, but she said, let's take a program, an AI program, and show it dogs. We will give it examples of dogs. And it should say, this is a dog, this is not a dog. And that AI program, which was within it had lots of examples, it learned by examples, was really what Wittgenstein said. So if you ask a 10-year-old coming out of that lecture, how do you define a dog? He'd say, well, by the examples it's been shown, which is actually what Wittgenstein told us in 1953 when he published Philosophical Investigations, that things like games, even adding to, they are all defined by examples, which was a very complicated idea at the time.
So Duncan, are you saying, I'm just going to paraphrase what I think the question might be, and that is, are you saying something like, could AI learn something from Wittgenstein's approach in the philosophical investigations in terms of rules?
All I'm saying is it could have done, but it came to the same conclusions its own way. But if it had been looking what Wittgenstein said in 1953, they might have come to the same conclusion an awful lot earlier.
So, okay, that's great, Duncan. So, you obviously get the gist now, presumably. So over to you.
Yeah. So I think this is definitely it seems true, and I think it's a very interesting point. So Wittgenstein again and again and again throughout the investigations emphasizes that that we don't have some background understanding behind that we can't access, and so it's a good example. So take the example of games, right? So you can think of lots of different kinds of games, like, you know, board games, Monopoly, Cluedo, whatever. And then you can think of like single player games like Solitaire. It's not really a board game, maybe it is. Then you can think of like sports. Video games are probably games. And then you can think of like gambling, like maybe there's a funny bit in the philosophical investigations where Wittgenstein imagines someone saying to someone else, "Oh, teach the kids a game," and then Wittgenstein teaches them gambling, and they go, "Oh no, that's not what I meant, not that kind of game." It's just, yeah. So there's lots of different kinds of games, and I think the idea is that Wittgenstein definitely wants to get to is you don't have some kind of background thing that's the same with all these games. This is the family resemblance stuff I was talking about. All you have is what you would say. So all you have is the examples that you could give, the similarities that you could draw out, and that's just what it is. Yeah, okay.
Yep, that's fine. Great. I wonder what Wittgenstein would have made of quantum computing, but that's for another day. We've got another gentleman here, and then we go to another question online.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for your talk. I work in the field of psychology, and I can really feel the extent to which social psychologists and cognitive psychologists ran with these topics from the 1950s onwards. I don't know either exactly whether they read what was published in 1953 or the mode of influence worked differently. I thought I'd ask a cheekier question, though. Who do you think of philosophers pre-Wittgenstein would have had their views really shaken had they had the ability to have read that kind of text from the ancients to the Renaissance and so on?
Yeah, that's good. This is just a question. Well, okay, so it's quite a boring answer, but really, Wittgenstein, when he writes the philosophical investigations, has a very clear kind of target in mind, and a big part of the target is his younger self. So Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus, as I said, abandoned philosophy, went away. And then he came back. And in the philosophical investigations, he refers to the author of the Tractatus as a kind of interlocutor who he's engaging with and wanting to kind of persuade or show. And so, again, I said that it's not clear how much he differs. Wittgenstein wanted, when he was going to get the philosophical investigations published when he was alive, he wanted to be published in a double edition with the Tractatus at the beginning, so that people would read the Tractatus and then read the philosophical investigations in light of that. And I guess that means that, as I said, it's quite a boring answer to the question. It means that there's a very direct kind of point of attack on that. He's really clearly focused on himself. And similarly, Russell, he's writing a lot against Russell. But Russell he was around to read the philosophical investigations. He read them, and he just thought they were terrible. He has this bit where he writes, you know, there's this whole school of scholarship around Wittgenstein now, and I don't understand any of it. I think Wittgenstein used to be interested in serious thinking, and he's just given it up. But okay, if I could sneak in a final third answer, I think maybe Freud or someone like that would have been really interesting to read Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein is in some ways quite an anti-psychologistic thinker. The private language argument, which I didn't go into too much, but all of these requirements for publicity or public nature that I was talking about can seem to go against maybe this idea that we have of this kind of rich mental life where there's all this stuff going on, which is maybe what psychologists, like Freud in particular, would have been interested in. And Wittgenstein did write remarks on psychoanalysis, but I think it would have been interesting to see some of those more psychoanalytic thinkers engaging with Wittgenstein's project.
Okay, thank you. Another one online is the difference between the earlier and later Wittgenstein a move from the analysis of language in itself to its use in given contexts?
Yeah, another good question. I'm not sure, because I think that firstly, when Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus and was thinking about the Tractatus, he was trying to provide a general theory of language, yeah, but he was doing that to try and unify the ways in which language is used. So there's a very famous, Wittgenstein's, in the Tractatus, his theory of language is, people call it the picture theory of language. And supposedly he developed this picture theory because he looked at a courtroom in France or something where he read about it in the newspaper, where they had done this kind of model of a crime scene, and they would kind of put everything out in the different places where it would have been in the crime scene to work out if this thing would have been feasible. And Wittgenstein had this epiphany, and he was like, oh, this is how language works. Words are isomorphic to the kind of events that we're describing in the same way as a picture might be, so that language makes a picture of the world. And in this way, it seems like he is thinking about language as something very much that's being used. And equally, in the philosophical investigations, part of the reason for talking about so many different kinds of language gains is presumably to make a point about how language works itself, not just the specific uses. I mean, when I talked about reading and things like that, he's not really interested in like telling you something about reading. He's using reading as an example to talk about language more generally. So I'm not sure I would see that being different.
Good. We've probably got enough time for one more question. If there is a burning question in the room, but if you could just pass it.
Well, I'm still trying to get my head around some of it, but the closer. Oh, that right. I'm still trying to get my head around some of the things. And one of the last ones was hearing what is true. And that's open to interpretation by the receiver. They may hear one thing from interpreting it from their own point of view, but that may not be what was intended from the person delivering it. And the other thing is, the person delivering it, you say it may be true, but they may, you say one thing, but believe another. And it just seems to be a whole nest of problems.
Yeah. So, so I think I don't know if I meant to put true, if I did. I meant the idea of hearing someone's meaning in their words, right? But still the same point you're saying applies, because someone could think that they hear someone's meaning in someone else's words, but be wrong. And then your challenge is, well, doesn't this show that when someone says something and we think we understand their meaning, we are doing an interpretation? So I think philosophers would say not necessarily, because otherwise, it would seem to make everything a kind of interpretation. So think about like seeing a color, right? You can look at something and think, oh, it's that color. And you can be wrong about that. Maybe it wasn't the color. Maybe it was, in weird light or something like that. But it doesn't seem to follow from that our seeing a color is interpreting something. I mean, you could think that. You could have a view of seeing where what happened was you got this visual stimulus in front of you, and then you interpreted that visual stimulus, and then you kind of said what it was. But that's not, I think those kind of views people have really moved away from because they just seem to, get into regresses quite fast. So people would just say, well, I can make a mistake of seeing something. It doesn't mean that I'm interpreting it just because I can make a mistake. And in the same way, with hearing someone's meaning in their words, I can make a mistake with what they mean. But that doesn't mean that I can't hear what they're meaning. It doesn't mean I'm doing an interpretation. It just means I'm mishearing in the same way as it would be if I missaw something. So it doesn't, the fact of errors doesn't show that what's going on there is an interpretation.
Okay, well, I think that is it for tonight, but please put your hands together for an excellent presentation.